Okay, so welcome to Unit 3, Theme 1, A Nation Headed for War. So throughout the antebellum period, many issues caused divisions among the people of the United States. So economies, meaning the way people made a living, was different in the North and in the South. And that helped these divisions. People thought they didn't, both sides didn't understand their ways of life. Growing populations were changing the balance of political power across the nation. So, and a lot of people were worried that these changes would affect their lives. Many citizens feared that their needs would not be met by this new political power coming in. So in the North, people really depended on wage labor to run growing industries, private businesses, and small family farms. So what that means is people were getting paid to work on these places. There were also a group of people called abolitionists who began to speak out against the practice of slavery. So that's going to help create conflict between the North and the South. Also in the North, as new immigrants began settling in these northern cities, the region gained more political power. In the South, though, most people made their living through agricultural pursuits, meaning they were farmers. Plantation owners depended heavily on slave labor to raise cotton, sugar cane, rice, and tobacco. They worried that America's leaders did not value the Southern way of life, and they believed the rights of individual states should be protected. Many did not think the federal government had the right to tell the states what to do. So really, in many ways, Arkansas was different from other southern states. About 80% of Arkansas families never owned slaves. One of the reasons is because farming in the Ozarks, where we live, and the Ouachita Mountains was very limited because of the rocky soil. So we don't have huge farmland available to grow crops like cotton and rice. That's in the eastern part, like the Gulf, Coastal Plain, and Delta areas. They had the most plantations because they had the better soil. So eventually, these slave owners became some of the most wealthy and powerful people in Arkansas. Slaves were an insignificant investment for plantation owners. They were expensive to buy and expensive to keep. So many planters spent more money on their slaves than they did on their land. Planter families enjoyed good food, nice clothes, and comfortable homes, and their children attended the best schools. So if you think about it, they had very nice things, and they may have thought that if these abolitionists up in the North spoke out against slavery, that where they were earning their money was going to disappear. So if they didn't have slaves to, work on the plantation, then who are they going to get to run the farm or the plantation? And they weren't going to have the nice things that they had while they owned slaves. And so in addition, wealthy planters gained great political power, and some began to voice their willingness to leave the Union to protect their privileged way of life. So think about it. We tend to hang out or want to hang out with the people who have the more money. That's how we gravitate. We gravitate to people or try to be friends with the people that have a lot of money. And for some reason, people who have a lot of money have a lot of power. And back then in the 1860s, in the 1800s, the people who had more money had a better education. And that's because they could pay for their education. You would only educate it if you could pay for it. The other thing is, if you are educated, you have more knowledge. And the more knowledge you have, the more power you have. And the more power you have, the bigger the voice, meaning people will listen to you more because they think you're important and they can influence things around you. So even though the smallest group of people had the most money, the smallest group of people actually had more influence than 80% of the population who didn't even own any slaves. That's pretty important. So the majority of Arkansans were more concerned with providing for their families and keeping their businesses going than they were with the politics surrounding slavery and states' rights. Unlike those who were willing to leave or secede from the Union, many Arkansans actually depended on federal support and protection. Citizens in western Arkansas relied on federal troops to protect them from hostile Indians. That's why Fort Smith was created. It's on the border of Arkansas and Oklahoma, right? And where did we move all the Indians? To Oklahoma. So there were federal troops who were stationed in Fort Smith, as well as the U.S. Marshals, to protect citizens from any Indian attacks. Another example of federal support was that in the South, as we know in the Gulf Coastal Plain areas, that residents benefited from the federal swamp draining projects. So that was a really good soil to farm in, but of course if there's water in it, then you can't do that. So they drained the water out and then used the soil for farming, and that provided a really decent life. So the majority of the people were really reluctant to give up these benefits. These and other issues divided the citizens of Arkansas, much like the regional divisions in other parts of the United States. So divisions in Arkansas also found their way into state politics, which usually happens. So you may remember reading about a dominant political group of the Democrats in Chapter 5, the previous chapter, called the Family or the Dynasty. This powerful group of cousins belonged to the Conway, Johnson, Sevier families. And eventually, a new group of people began to challenge the family's grip on politics in Arkansas. One of the leaders of this new group was an ambitious man from the Delta named Thomas Hindman. Hindman was known as a fire eater because of his passionate support for secession and states' rights. He and others wanted to elect an Arkansas governor who was not a member of the family. So their chance came during the elections of 1860. So Arkansas's race for governor in 1860 was nothing short of war. The Democratic family hoped to continue their tight hold on Arkansas politics by nominating Richard Johnson for governor. Thomas Hindman and other Arkansans worked hard to upset their plans. They supported an independent Democrat from Saline County named Henry M. Rector. Now, many people who were unhappy with typical family politics sided with Rector. In the end, he narrowly won the election, and the family's political dynasty was soon over. So let's talk about Mr. Rector, Governor Rector. When he became governor, he was 44 years old, and unfortunately, he was not a very strong leader. He was very unsure of himself, I think. He believed in the Southern cause, but in the beginning, he wasn't sure if Arkansas should secede. But he said, I feel like something's about to happen, so we need to be ready. Because Rector could not make up his mind about secession, another group of Arkansans decided to make a move they hoped would force a decision. This was called the Arsenal Incident. In February of 1861, a group of men who supported secession marched to Little Rock to gain control of the arsenal, which was guarded by Union troops. The arsenal was used by the U.S. Army to store guns, ammunition, and other military items. To avoid bloodshed, Governor Rector convinced Union Commander James Totten to surrender. Totten and his troops were allowed to evacuate the arsenal, but the guns, ammunition, and other supplies became property of the state. Some historians believe that if Totten had not surrendered the arsenal, the Civil War might have started in Little Rock. Following the takeover, Governor Rector and the state legislature supported a political convention in Little Rock. And what that means is they gathered all the legislators, like the senators, to decide whether or not to secede. Many voices were heard supporting both sides of the issue, but in the end, the convention voted not to secede. They were just not ready to break away yet, because as we know, Arkansas did finally secede eventually. So even the majority of Arkansas's citizens were not ready to leave the Union. Other states were, like Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas. They all followed South Carolina's decision to secede, and they decided to secede when Lincoln became president. When he was elected president, South Carolina was like, not going to take it. See you later. And they seceded. They also named Jefferson Davis the president of the Confederacy. So, in the spring of 1861, Confederate forces demanded the surrender of federal troops at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. And of course, Fort Sumter was like, no, because it was held by Union troops. But it was in a state that seceded from the Union. So it's kind of weird. So President Lincoln actually did something very, very smart. He refused to pull his troops out of the fort, but said, don't fire on anybody. But I am going to send you supplies. I'll tell you why that's smart. Because he knew that if the Union fired from the fort first, then the North would be blamed for the Civil War. So he allowed the Confederate soldiers to fire first so that eventually, if we're going to blame someone, that the South would be to blame to fire the first shots. So in a way, that was a really good strategy on Lincoln's part. So on April 12th, 1861, the Confederacy did fire on Fort Sumter, and you can see where the little explosion is. That's where Fort Sumter is. You can go today and check it out. Now, almost immediately, Lincoln called for thousands of volunteers to put down the rebellion of the southern states, but Governor Rector refused to send any men from Arkansas, and more Arkansans stopped fighting against secession. Now people were beginning to voice their approval. So Arkansas was ready to secede. So I believe there you have an assignment to read the Arkansas or the Arsenal Incident telegrams, and they're kind of interesting. So have fun with that, and I'll see you next time.